Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. For our next session, we have Empowering Communities through the Sustainable Energy Transition. We're very excited for this panel. If you could all please join me in welcoming our panelists and moderators to the stage. We have Kelsey Clair from the New York Green Bank, Michael Grossman from Climate United, Campbell Howe from the Department of Energy Loan Programs Office, and our moderator, Nadia Zaets from Whitehall Company and adjunct professor at Columbia Business School.
Okay, does this work? Perfect. Well, hi everyone and welcome. Thanks for coming. So I'm Nadia Zaets. I'm a managing director at Whitehall Company. What we do, we're an advisor to developers, we're advisor to financial sponsors, and we help raise capital for renewable projects, energy transition projects, and the infrastructure industry in general. So I'm here today with a group of investors, mainly on the credit side. So if you guys want to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey Clair. I'm a managing director on the investments team at New York Green Bank and alum of Columbia Business School 2022. I'm happy to be here with you today. Thank you for having me. New York Green Bank is a $1 billion credit fund of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. You can think of us as the credit arm of that division. We seek to invest in projects that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions in New York State and also fill financing gaps. So think projects that are unable to get large banks to answer the phone. That's where we try to come in and provide some catalytic capital. Investment targets is somewhere between $5 and $50 million. It can flex up or down from there. And we invest across many technologies that will achieve the goals that I just outlined.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here on a Saturday. My name is Campbell Howe. I am a senior strategy advisor in DOE's Loan Programs Office. The Loan Programs Office, for folks who aren't aware, essentially provides loans and loan guarantees to large-scale clean energy projects located in the United States. We are technology agnostic, but these technologies are they've been largely de-risked, right? So this is really to finance a large-scale project that is looking for a first-of-a-kind commercial-scale deployment. So these projects are largely around $1 billion. We don't have an upper threshold. We've provided loans and loan guarantees for projects that are ranging from electrolytic hydrogen production to methane detection networks to distributed solar generation on tribal lands. So happy to get into more detail on those later.
Morning, and thank you. My name is Michael Grossman. I'm the Chief Investment Officer at Climate United. About 10 weeks ago, Climate United received a $7 billion grant from the EPA as part of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to capitalize a national green lending institution. Our objective is to reduce greenhouse gases, which, given that we got our money from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, is a good first objective. It is to empower and bring benefits to American communities and to catalyze financial markets. Climate United is a consortium of 3 firms. Community Preservation Corporation, which is a long-time, 50-year-old multifamily affordable housing developer. Self-Help Credit Union, which is a national network of low-income, low-FICO, low-wealth consumer lenders. And Calvert Impact, which is a lender to and through community-facing intermediaries. And we will deploy capital with the objective to accelerate the availability of climate finance solutions in American communities.
Excellent. So I guess to Kelsey, what's your guys' definition? And a bunch of you said you're technology agnostic, but what is the definition of energy transition? Because from what I'm finding, each firm has their own. So what technologies do you cover?
Yeah, so this can change over time due to our goal of energizing financial markets and filling gaps where there's not access to capital. So, we were founded in 2013. The first couple of years, we did a lot of investing in the community solar market to try and prove out that business model, that it could be financed by commercial lenders in a very de-risked way, which I think has been achieved. We recently announced reaching New York State's goal of 6 gigawatts of community solar deployed. And so at this moment, there's no longer a large financing gap for the New York Green Bank to provide for that technology. So we've adjusted and moved on to other uses of capital. An area where I focus a lot of my time is battery storage, trying to help developers invest in this technology in a way that is economic and that provides them with a good rate of capital. We're a market rate lender. We have to be so that we can crowd in private capital over time. If we issue a concessionary rate, that's not going to be very attractive to a commercial bank. And so we're trying to find solutions that are creative and enable deployment in technologies like energy storage over time. We also are focused on clean transportation. It's another difficult market to lend to. Both of these technologies that I mentioned have an element of merchant exposure where, the revenue profile is unknown. There's uncertainty, there's volatility, there's not a ton of transaction precedent that you can look at, historical data on how to underwrite, what's the right loan size. And so those are two areas that I'm focused on trying to come up with a mousetrap that works, that protects the bank's downside, but provides that capital that is needed to energize those technologies and enable deployment at scale.
I guess to get a little bit more into detail on what you said, from what I'm seeing with regards to, electric vehicles as an example and underwriting of that on that front, the main issue has been, the useful life of those batteries. I guess, do you guys take a view on that? Like, what do you do, for the students here to size the debt on something like this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't at the moment done a transaction where we're actually taking residual value risk, as you say, because the question is, what is the thing worth after 10 years of usage, which we just haven't seen yet. But it is something that we're working on with our colleagues. We have a great benefit of having folks that sit just in the same room as us that are working for the Energy and Research Division and providing really helpful data, and can also maybe provide some incentives to provide somewhat of a floor on the end price of that vehicle. So that's something we're actively working on, finding a solution.
We're actually working on a transaction which we hope to announce on Tuesday, which Climate United will take extensive residual value risk. It's so interesting because it's purely a financial market failure question. Why don't bankers lend for electric vehicles? Because not enough people have sold used electric vehicles yet. So a bank which is acting rationally as it's supposed to, representing its shareholders and depositors, is not able to take that risk. And so what we're looking at doing is for heavy duty electric trucks, so trucks that cost about $500,000 each, this problem is much more accentuated, right? A Tesla, which is expensive, at the end of the day, if you're talking about $5,000 or $10,000 of a residual value, it can be manageable even at a small portfolio basis. But for a truck that costs $500,000, the residual value question after a couple of years still remains significant. So what we're going to do is we hope to buy a large number of trucks, lease them to small operators, and in 4 years sell them, and then establish a secondary market value so that we can crowd in rationally acting banks. Interesting.
So I guess then a follow-up question to you, that kind of debt, where is that priced compared to, what a bank loan would look like?
So it's not really debt, right? At the end of the day, what we hope to do is buy trucks, have the traditional financiers of those trucks finance whatever the 50%, 40%, 30%, whatever the market will bear. The rest of the risk we'll take on our books, and we expect to generate a return when we sell the trucks. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I don't know what's a reasonable return. 7, 8, 9% per annum, I think probably makes sense. I don't know what the market will bear. I think it could be higher than that, depending how well we structure our truck leases. And there are a number of incentive programs available to bring the cost of trucks down to price parity with diesels. And so if we can capture those, I think this could be a reasonably attractive financial transaction as well.
Very interesting. We need to talk after this because I've just closed the deal where it was over 100 million equity investment into the vehicle leasing and charging platform out of California. And there it was, an equity investment, but that needs to be over time optimized.
Well, that's exactly it. We were approached by someone who was building charging infrastructure who said, okay, if we're building charging infrastructure, how do we make it work? But we need people who are going to buy charging.
Yes, absolutely. Interesting. So, here we've been talking about something that, is relatively proven technology in terms of, we've seen those vehicles on the roads. We don't know how long the battery is going to last exactly, but at least, this is something proven. So, but I guess, Campbell, you talked about kind of bridging the gap between what's proven and what's not, because, lenders often have a hard time with something where there is technology risk. So can you talk about that and how you kind of help deal with that?
Yeah, happy to. So LPO is primarily financing projects that have a TRL of 8 or 9, maybe 7, right? So actually the technology is fairly de-risked. However, there is some semblance of perceived market risk or commercial risk, which is why traditional commercial lenders aren't coming into the deal. And so what LPO is really serving is that bridge to bankability so that we can provide really low cost debt, so treasury plus 3/8, give or take. And we're really just looking for a reasonable prospect of repayment on our loan. And so we're able to then crowd in, as mentioned, private sector equity providers, because we're typically taking the most senior secured debt position. And so we're bringing in equity investors for, maybe that 20%, give or take, of a project size. And that the real semblance there is that we're then proving out to the market that this works, and we do want to catalyze a market here at scale. And so the idea is that a traditional lender will then see that first of a kind working, and then they'll go ahead and finance the second, third, fourth of a kind and really generate something meaningful.
Really interesting. I guess my next question to everybody, give us an example of a deal that you have worked on, key challenges that you faced there, and kind of, takeaways for the audience here.
We could keep talking about clean transportation, maybe. So while we haven't done a residual value risk transaction, we are in the process of closing a transaction for a charging infrastructure company. I think this is a really great place for us to spend our time because the role of government at some point is to catalyze the market towards a target and to solve a problem that is sort of a stuck market dynamic. So in charging, there's a chicken and egg problem. People don't want to buy electric vehicles because they think there's not enough charging, and folks don't want to invest in charging infrastructure because they think there's not enough vehicles to use the charging. And so if New York Green Bank can step in and help to deploy the charging, then we think that will alleviate some of this risk, the range anxiety, and catalyze that market for electric vehicle transition. And what we're relying on is some government targets. So in New York City, there's the Green Rides Initiative where by 2030, all ride-share vehicles need to be electrified. So that's Uber, Lyft, Revel, taxis. And so that gives us enough comfort to bet on the market transitioning by that time period and that the demand will come. And through some creative structuring, I'll say, because there is still merchant exposure. This is not a contracted offtake, that traditionally lends itself to project finance lending. We're needing to use different features like sweeps and creative modeling to get this done. And we're charging a market rate, but I would say we've definitely subsidized our time a bit in trying to figure this out. But as I think you heard on the last panel, the passion among my colleagues is there to try and figure these things out. This is where we want to spend our time, and we think this could be really impactful for New York State, which excites me because I'm from New York, and I'm just really excited to actually see this deployed right here.
Sure. I won't talk about a deal in particular. I'm actually going to broaden it out and actually talk about a program, pulling on Kelsey's last thread on offtake. So for any deal to pencil, right, you do need to have long-term, high-quality offtake. And part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we were able to carve out $8 billion to finance a series of regional clean hydrogen hubs across the country. And I think what was particularly interesting about that was that we've identified and selected 7 different regional projects. And again, these hubs are meant to have regional supply and demand and the corresponding midstream infrastructure. But what we recognized was that the willingness to pay for clean hydrogen just wasn't meeting, it wasn't penciling with the deal. And so what the Department of Energy really did was actually carve out up to $1 billion of that $8 billion to create a demand side strategic initiative that they're actually working on currently to figure out what are the right end markets to make this technology work. So similarly, when you're thinking about EV charging, you need to find the EVs to meet that demand and to make these deals pencil. And so the DOE is working very creatively, I think, to make sure that a lot of these production-focused programs will end up penciling out on a deal side when you think about offtake.
So can you elaborate on that a little bit? Are you kind of thinking through what the end users would be, or are you subsidizing PPAs, or like how does this work?
Yeah, so the hydrogen demand side initiative is still being designed. So I think they're determining whether or not a contract for differences program really works there and identifying if there's particular sectors that might make sense. But I'll pick on LPO recently financed or provided a conditional commitment, to Plug Power to produce electrolytic hydrogen up to 6 different projects, starting first with one that's located in West Texas. And the reason why we were really excited by that deal on the LPO side, this is separate from the hydrogen demand side initiative, but it's because they were able to identify forklifts and materials handling as being a really interesting end market where there are a select number of warehousing operators and logistics companies that were really interested in paying a premium for the more expensive zero carbon hydrogen that they're producing. So forklift operations, not a massive market, right? It's not the same as if you're thinking about hydrogen for applications on road-based transport. However, it's one where, again, you could sort of see that the economics work, at least on that deal side.
Thanks. Michael?
I'm going to spend next week talking about transportation all the time because we're announcing this transaction. So I'm going to change sectors and talk about the first deal we closed last week. And I will attribute our success on this deal to the New York Green Bank because we basically, I don't want to say stole, but adopted a product that they've successfully deployed in New York State and deployed outside New York State. And what we've done is we're doing pre-development finance for someone who's solarizing the University of Arkansas. So if you think about how solar works right now, to get interconnections, anyone who's developing solar has to put big deposits down with utilities. And those deposits, like we're working on a transaction now where we expect the deposit to last for 5 years. So think about small-scale developers and the cost of making a $7 or a $10 million deposit and having it sit somewhere for 5 years. We really think that that's the best use of capital like ours. It's non-productive assets that are high risk and supporting, really small developers. So it's something that we're really excited about. I also want to say it's a deal I'm not at all excited about. And that's because if I think about how Climate United is going to drive change in financial markets, it's not by doing project finance. It's by lending to the community-facing intermediaries that can provide climate finance solutions to communities. We can't do the $3, $5, $7 million community solar loans that are needed to really energize or solarize or electrify or decarbonize all of American communities. We can only work with intermediaries. So I'm really excited to work on this specific project because University of Arkansas is a highly charismatic counterparty, and it's really exciting to do work in a tough state like Arkansas. I think if I think about how we're really going to drive change, it's through intermediary lending, not direct project lending. And this just was something that we were able to do really quickly. So I love this deal, and I hate it at the same time.
And what was the approximate size?
$32 million.
$32 million. Excellent. I guess all of you guys mentioned, or Kelsey mentioned, the government and the regulations with regards to, making, for example, vehicles green by a certain date. I guess more generally, how do you see, regulations come in and, be helpful in the decarbonization process? Helpful or not helpful enough, or, either?
So both ways. So helpful, the Port of Los Angeles. I just said I wasn't going to talk about transportation, but now I will. The Port of Los Angeles, through which 15% of all goods that enter the United States pass. So think about that for a second. 1 in 7 things that you see go through the Port of Los Angeles, right? They passed a rule starting in 2024 that any truck that is newly registered on the truck registry, which you need to do to enter the port, needs to be zero emissions. So the amount of trucks, there's 300 zero emissions trucks deployed in the Los Angeles port. They've doubled in the year 2024 the amount of freight that's carried by zero emissions vehicles from 1% to 2%. 2% is about $60 billion. So if you think about like the size of that, it's already enormous, but it's absolutely tiny if you think it's 2%. And it's the regulation that drove it. So it's really exciting. Going forward, that same penetration is it could be constrained by another regulation, which is a regulation around that applies, I think, specifically to us and may apply to you guys as well a little bit. And I'm not sure about the New York Green Bank, which is a regulation around Build America. So we have domestic content requirements. Completely support the idea of spending U.S. taxpayer money to support American industry and American laborers. Makes perfect sense. However, there's just not a lot of American industry right now. And so the idea of buying domestically manufactured trucks or vehicles or panels is just really challenging right now. And that's a regulation that will continue to constrain our ability to deploy climate finance solutions more broadly.
Any other views?
Sure, I can just say quickly in case students want more of like a structured response. I think the role of government is to set a target that creates a market signal for investment and then provide some incentive, because a lot of these renewable technologies we're talking about, the primary cost is upfront, and if it's difficult to get capital, that's where you need assistance the most. So some incentive that brings down the cost and de-risks the investment for those looking at their ROI and thinking, how am I going to hit this? And then step aside and let the private markets do what they need to do. And so that's where New York Green Bank seeks to come in and provide some of that catalytic capital. The developers get some incentives. It's de-risked. They have a more palatable cost of capital, and the deployment can happen at scale, and we can be crowded out by the private market, and then we can move on to the next challenge.
Thank you.
The last element also I think is important to talk about in terms of standardization is also safety, right? I mean, I do think that regulation plays a critical role not only in setting targets, right, and then of course building out the appropriate policy in order to enable it, but it's also to ensure that this clean energy transition is happening in a very safe and effective manner. So thinking about who are the regulatory oversight bodies who are, for example, overseeing the safe development of hydrogen pipelines or carbon pipelines, making sure that if we're thinking through primacy for Class 6 wells, carbon capture and sequestration has been, largely stymied by the fact that, there's just not enough sequestration permitting that's happening. And so, of course, regulation can be made more effective, but it does play a really critical in making sure that we're minimizing things like potential leakages. So I'm obviously representative of the Department of Energy, so I'm in many ways, in favor of regulation, in favor of policy in order to ensure that this is a safe and very equitable transition, which I also think we can talk about later.
That's great. No, that's helpful. I was talking to students the other day about regulation, federal versus state versus local. Put everybody to bed. Literally had some folks sleeping in class, but I think it's really important to make sure we understand how things are regulated and are able to develop this most efficiently around all the regulation that's there. I guess moving on to a different topic, from my experience, what's been interesting about, energy transition is that we're moving on from, the structures that investors are, so used to having, for example, a large project, right, with stable cash flows, which they then finance, and they have a specific beginning of construction, and that's when they put the money in. and that all works out. Now, now we have, with energy transition, maybe instead of one project, we have many little ones. And your return is highly dependent on the number of projects that you can implement. For example, charging stations or vehicles that you deploy. So-called scale-up risk. So over the last year, we've seen dramatic evolution in large infrastructure investor, equity investor views on not being able to take that scale-up risk. I guess my question to you guys, and maybe to Michael first, how do you guys deal with scale-up risk in your investments?
Well, that's the risk we take, right? We finance commercially viable, commercially deployable, financeable, right? We do credit, so financeable solutions. We're early lenders. We take credit risk. We try to support markets. Our job is to catalyze financial markets and bring in commercial capital. At the end of the day, if I'm a lender to someone maybe a second or third time, it probably means we're not doing a very good job, right? So the objective is to help sectors more than companies, again, because we're an intermediary lender. So our objective is to help sectors scale up so that they can receive much larger institutional capital over time. So that's the risk we want to take.
Yeah, I'm happy to touch on this. I think the way that we can also tamp down scale-up risk is if we get everyone in the industry to be speaking about our energy transition, or actually like saying energy transformation, but in a cohesive way. So the Department of Energy has created a cross-department effort called our Pathways to Commercial Liftoff. These have culminated into a series of reports, which you can find at liftoff.energy.gov. But really what these are meant to do is create a singular vocabulary really around how we should be thinking about some of these new technologies. We have not yet written one on EV charging or EVs, but we've written them on advanced nuclear, for example. Mm-hmm. And these reports are really meant to help guidepost what the Department of Energy, again, thinking about all of our different programmatic offices, our Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, our LPO team, as well as our national labs. We go out and then we share some of those findings out with the market to understand what are the market realities. We bring all of this in and then we say, all right, what's it really going to take to scale this new industry? And so in advanced nuclear, for example, what we're really speaking about is, look, there's so many early stage new reactor designs, but is that really going to be effective at scale? Probably not. We actually probably should be getting anyone who's interested in investing in advanced nuclear to pool all of their money together and really think about deploying and creating learning curves, right? And helping things kind of come down the cost curves just by deploying at scale. And so, if you read that report, for example, they're talking about how AP1000s should be getting deployed much more effectively, whether it's at reinstituting them at retiring nuclear facilities or building greenfield sites, right? So we were able to deploy 4 of them through the Vogtle project down in the southeast. And so the idea is that the cost of Vogtle 4 reactor implementation was significantly cheaper than the first one. Mm-hmm. And the reason why was because, again, we're trying to rinse and repeat some of these models. And so I think when we think about scale-up risk, we also think about, starting all the way at our R&D and more effectively think about how to pull that up. Interesting.
I guess, since you touched on nuclear, what do you see in terms of, timeline toward, to commercialization? Usually in my job, we kind of start looking at things when they are, probably 2 years before it becomes fully commercial to, develop relationships. Are we 10 years away? What do you think?
Well, I think in some instances nuclear is being commercialized, right? So LPO was able to close a loan on repowering up the Palisades project over in Michigan. 3 Mile Island is getting repowered. That announcement just came out a couple of weeks ago. So I do actually think that you're seeing utility scale nuclear, coming online here. And again, thinking a lot more about our AP1000 reactors and implementing that technology. In terms of SMRs too, I do think that we're seeing a lot of private sector announcements, right? Whether it's, a lot of these hyperscalers, Google and Amazon have both in recent weeks issued out very important announcements around long-term offtake with, I believe, 2 different SMR technology companies. I think nuclear is a little bit challenged because you do have to get your reactor designs through NRC, and so that might take a little bit of time. I think it's hard to know for sure, but I do think, at least with AP1000s, those are ready to go. And whether you're thinking about building a greenfield site or taking, I can't remember, it's in the report, but I think it's something like 60% of our existing nuclear sites are scheduled for decommissioning, I think, in the next 5 years. So there's a really interesting opportunity there.
Great. I guess folks are pointing to the
People
time.
disagree.
I'm always excited about this, but I guess we only have 5 more minutes. One question I was going to ask, the elephant in the room, electrification of the economy, right, versus, really reliability. And how do you guys see, do you guys see gas as part of energy transition, or do you not? And how do we bridge the gap with all of these, data centers, as you mentioned, trying to come online with gigawatts of power demand? How do we square the circle, so to speak, here?
I can go first. So I'll try to be brief because I do think, I'm sure the panelists have great things to say. But, first and foremost, I do think that, creating a completely clean power grid is entirely possible. And, achieving a net zero economy here in the US by 2050 is entirely achievable. And I do believe that in order to do that, we should not be thinking about things on an apples to apples transition. I think so often people think about maybe these 3 tailwinds around increasing load growth, right, or increasing electricity demand, right? Data centers certainly being one of them, and perhaps maybe the most pressing. But you're also seeing electrify everything, and then you're also seeing manufacturing jobs, which Michael actually touched on, right, coming here. And so we've got these 3 opportunities that are creating obviously higher rates for ratepayers. And so I think the transition is not just an apples to apples of phasing out natural gas and coal for clean generation, although that's critical, right? We do need clean, firm generation, whether it's nuclear, whether it's thinking about enhanced geothermal. But there's so much that we can do with the grid that we've already paid for, whether we're thinking about advanced grid technology solutions like advanced reconductoring or dynamic line rating, or thinking more about virtual power plants, which I know is a topic of interest for a lot of students. But there's so much that we can do in terms of making our grid more efficient over time, as well as continuing to decarbonize other, hard to abate sectors, whether we're thinking about trucking, whether we're thinking about port infrastructure, whether we're thinking about aviation fuel as well. So I think there's a lot to be done. I think it's entirely achievable, but it's not just an apples to apples of thinking about power generation. There's a lot of other technologies out there that are available and that should be deployed.
What she said.
Great. So I guess the very last one, a lot of students come to me after class and they ask, where and how should I get involved? What kind of options are there for me post-graduation? So any advice to the students in terms of how do they, make the most impact in this process?
Do something you love, right? I know it's one of those things that everyone says and you never really get it until you're actually doing something you don't love and you see how hard work is. So do something you love. We're trying to solve challenging problems. So embrace it, love it, and do that. Also, I do finance, I do credit. Credit is an apprenticeship business. You learn credit by doing credit. I'm sure all the students who ask you are really brilliant, but that doesn't mean they know how to do credit. But they don't know how to do credit not because there's something wrong with their brains, just because they haven't done it, right? So you have to learn to do this. And if you think about where's the best place to learn, if you learn at a place like Morgan Stanley, and I'm just using a name, I have nothing against Morgan Stanley. It's a wonderful company. I'm sure it's hiring a great number of amazing students from Columbia. But if you learn at a place like Morgan Stanley and you mess up, the only thing you lose is money. And it's money that's spread over so many owners that probably no one really ever feels it. If you're working in social impact investing or environmental impact investing and you mess up, and we all do, right? It's natural. When you mess up, you're hurting the planet or you're hurting people. So go learn in a real bank and then come to the social or environmental sector when you can bring your tools and you've learned.
And that's my career path.
Probably everybody here, mine as well. Well, should we open that to broader questions? questions from the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks to all of you guys for doing this. This was a wonderful discussion. We're going to open up the panel to a few questions that we've aggregated from the audience. So I'll start with this first one. What are your thoughts on the cost of electric vehicles to the environment, health, and the indigenous livelihood in South America due to lithium mining? It's a pretty heavy question. But more broadly speaking, the ways in which we can account for the disadvantaged communities in this energy transition and bring them along with us.
Good question. Easy question, right? I mean, you know, we all should be, as consumers, we should be buying things from ethical supply chains. I lived and worked in Africa for 20 years. I worked at Citibank, I worked for the US government, and I worked at McKinsey. And I remember having a conversation with the president of Madagascar, and he's like, well, when you guys did it, CNN wasn't around. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, you tore up your environment and you know, violated human rights and labor, and no one noticed or cared. And now there's all these rules, and you're saying we can't do this and we can't do that. And I get it, but it's keeping us poor. So understanding that trade-off between consumption and our ethical behavior and how it works for the markets in which we source our goods, it's really important. And it's not just one answer saying, oh, we shouldn't mine lithium because it harms a community. We should try to make sure that the community's goals, intents, objectives, and considerations are brought into that mining project.
Yeah, it is absolutely critical to bring community into the investment decision process, and New York Green Bank has a goal of having at least 40% of its investments within disadvantaged communities and benefiting low to moderate income New Yorkers. But I will just bring back up something Campbell said earlier, which was about safety and also education. I think that's paramount to the energy transition, making sure everyday folks understand why is it beneficial to have a battery energy storage system in my community? Well, because it enables reliable, renewable energy to power your devices, your homes. And so I think education along the way will really go far in helping us all further the transition together.
Yeah, I'm just quickly adding on that last point. So the Biden-Harris administration has an objective in which 40% of all government funding should be going to disadvantaged communities. Does go to disadvantaged communities. So LPO certainly follows that. I would say actually about a third of our loans actually have gone into the critical minerals and materials space. So thinking about upstream supply chains for batteries, for EVs, for solar modules and panels as well. So that's an important conversation, and I think just reframing it from do no harm to actually how can we do better and actually do well, because projects won't really get to FID unless you have the support of the communities that you're working in. And so the Department of Energy actually has a variety of different resources that are now available to think about community benefits planning. And so it's not just necessarily thinking about jobs and apprenticeships, although that's critically important for local communities, but thinking about other creative ways to really help ensure that these projects come online in a safe, equitable, and just manner.
Super, thank you all. As a follow-up question, I guess, what steps are you all taking to make sure that these communities are brought to the table in terms of decision-making and that they are having a voice rather than being the affected in terms of these investments?
I'll go very quickly. It's a requirement for us that they're in the conversation early.
Yeah. We have a structured community outreach process.
Super. Okay. I guess following up on that, separate question, more from the financing perspective. When you take a look at how you're allocating catalytic capital, what are the criteria that help you determine which markets are most ripe for catalytic capital?
I can start. So most of the people that work at New York Green Bank used to work on Wall Street. And so when we're assessing an investment, we're looking for something that we think is just on the cusp of being bankable. There's something about it that it looks like risk to commercial bankers that we don't think is really risk, and we want to go in and demonstrate that, do a great deal that somebody copies, and then crowds us out. So we look at battery energy storage as a great example. There's not a ton of data on how these things perform, but we think that if we do the first couple of transactions, that we could demonstrate that this is a bankable technology, this is a bankable revenue stream, and we'll price it in a way that's just a little bit attractive, maybe just a little bit more expensive than a solar project, for example, and then that will be so attractive to commercial banks, we'll call them because we want this transition to happen. We want competition to come in and reduce costs, and they will refinance us out, or they'll do the next project.
Yep, LPO has a very similar mandate. LPO has a very similar mandate in that, but I would say that LPO is not discretionary, right? So anyone can apply for an LPO loan or loan guarantee at any point in time, and if you meet our eligibility criteria, you get it, right? So we don't actually require, we don't have some sort of investment thesis other than, the projects must have a significant and certain GHG reduction requirement. As we spoke about, they do have to have a community benefits plans. They do have to have a NEPA review, which is, speaking about regulation, an important facet. But we have all of that, criteria that's available online. And so if you meet those eligibility requirements and you fit into one of our programs, which are also available, then that's how you're able to receive a loan or a loan guarantee. But speaking about some of the other DOE offices for a moment, I think what's been really interesting is in the last year, for every $1 of DOE either grant, award money, or loan, there's been $6 of private sector crowd-in this last year. And so we do think that we're tapping into the right technologies, into the right markets, where there is private sector interest to really ensure that we're maximizing the DOE impact and the taxpayer money. So it's exciting.
We're just getting started, so we haven't really figured this out yet. We're starting with 3 priority sectors, and those sectors are pretty broad: distributed generation and storage, building decarbonization, and zero emissions transportation. We, the investment team at Climate United will double on Monday from 3 to 6. So like a lot of capacity is getting built as we speak. What I hope to do is really, what I don't want to do as we build out this organization is just do really cool transactions. That's what the LPO gets to do, right? They work on really interesting, really big transactions. What we want to do is really stimulate the financial sector by lending through lenders. And so to do that, what we really need to develop is, an investment thesis for each sector to understand how our capital will drive change. And once we understand how our capital will drive change, then we can start doing kind of like the asset allocations or asset acceptance criteria that will allow us to choose between assets. In the interim, we're doing some things because we're working opportunistically. The deal we did in Arkansas, we did because net metering expired in Arkansas on October 1st. And if they didn't close it by September 30th, they were not going to electrify the University of Arkansas. So we had the capacity and the team in place to do something quickly. So we'll continue to pursue things that we can do that are bankable, closable, and what I would describe as relatively high profile until we develop those kind of strategies.
Super. And final question, and perhaps a challenging and topical one. In the event of political and leadership change, how do you guys anticipate the progress in the energy transition to be threatened? Or perhaps rephrasing it, how have you bolstered the work that you guys have done to ensure that it's insulated from political change in the coming years and months?
So again, just getting started, but we expect that the value that we create for American communities across the country is so high that why would anyone want to discontinue the investment programs that we're financing? We believe that the energy transformation, and I love that term, is going to create wealth for a large number of Americans. And so by providing capital to support that transition, we don't think that's a political or a partisan kind of consideration.
Yeah, we get this question a lot at LPO. We have our loan authority for some programs until 2026, and I believe a few others through 2028. So there would need to be another act of legislation to unwind that loan authority. I will also say that we are, ramping up and processing, $60 billion of loans per year, and a lot of our loan capital is going towards, red states, and we're creating thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs in these states. And, you've got certain politicians who are going to those ribbon cuttings. And so I think in many ways, what we're seeing is that this is a bipartisan effort, right? We're creating new jobs. We're stimulating an entire economy, right? We're thinking about apprenticeships, and, we're creating a healthier environment. So we're going to continue. LPO now has around 460 people. Speaking to how we can get involved, we're definitely still hiring. We want smart CBS graduates to be coming and joining us in the summer when they graduate. So we're continuing to do the work.
And just to plug, we're fully self-sustained at New York Green Bank. We don't rely on additional investments from the government. So, and we also have lots of opportunities for folks to come work for us.
Wonderful. Well, let's give it up for our incredible panel, everyone.